Right, so welcome to our workshop on using rubrics for assessment. And there's another workshop that's more about the nuts and bolts of creating rubrics in Blackboard, and that'll be offered this month as well, and I'll go over the details on that a little bit later. All right, so I am your presenter today. My name is Amanda Smothers. I'm the Teaching and Learning Coordinator in CITL. I earned my PhD in English from NIU in 2016, and I've been teaching college English for about 15 years. I teach a combination of face-to-face, hybrid, and online courses, and I teach students with a wide range of ages and experiences. I'm a big fan of rubrics, and I use them for most of my assessments, whether they're formative or summative. Our objectives for today are to define some different types of rubrics, examine the components of a rubric, discuss how to design an effective rubric, and then review examples of and resources for creating rubrics. And I will send you links to those and files for those examples after our workshop today as well, so you have those. So a little bit about you, if you want to share your name, your role, your division or department in the chat so that we can all get to know each other, that would be great. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Elise. Thanks, Tina. All right, so we have a good kind of variety of disciplines represented here today. And rubrics can be used in any discipline and for really any task that you have your students complete. So I just want to reflect and discuss our current experience with rubrics, so I know where everyone's at with how you've used rubrics when you're grading, how you've been assessed using rubrics, if at all. How do you feel about using rubrics? What do you think are the benefits? What do you think are the challenges? And what are you hoping to gain from this workshop? So if you want to, you can answer those questions in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and answer them aloud, whichever you feel most comfortable with. Thank you, Anna. Anna's used rubrics for most major assignments and thinks they make grading more transparent for students, and is hoping to learn more about universal ways to set up rubrics. Great. Thank you. That's a good point, Elise. So one of the benefits of rubrics is that students do know the expectations of the assignment, how they're going to be graded, what you're prioritizing in that assessment. Right, so I'm going to move on to the next slide. If you're still typing, please continue, and I will address those as they come into the chat. So some questions that you'll want to consider as you prepare to assess student work. One is, what are the attributes of quality performance on the task? So in other words, what qualities or features would demonstrate whether students have produced an exemplary response to the task? What do you expect to see if this task is completed proficiently or adequately or even deficiently? Do you have any models of student work that exemplify the criteria that you'll use to assess this task? Rubrics can help us answer these questions. Thanks, Tina. Tina wants to learn more ways to set up rubrics. So what is a rubric? First of all, a rubric's an assessment tool. As we know, it's a systematic scoring guide. It's also an instructional guide showing students how they will be assessed, as Elise mentioned. And it's an explicit set of criteria used for assessing a specific type of work or performance. So each rubric is going to look differently depending on what you're assessing. What can rubrics accomplish, or what can they do? Rubrics can help us to set anchor points along a quality continuum, so we can set up reasonable and appropriate expectations for our students, and we can consistently judge how well they've met them. They also help us divide an assignment into its component parts and then provide a detailed description for students of what constitutes acceptable and unacceptable levels of performance for each part. So that shows students how they can succeed on the assessment. So there's lots of benefits of rubrics. Some of them are that it helps us to assess complex and subjective criteria. It helps us evaluate student performance, helps us provide for precise and more accurate judgment of student work. It also helps us provide a common format for stating criteria and standards so that students know, once you've taught them how to read a rubric, they'll understand how to do that for each subsequent rubric, because there's a common format. It also informs students of the criteria that you expect for success, and it also helps us document and communicate our grading process. There are some potential drawbacks to rubrics too. There are times when you might need to be subjective when assessing student performance outcomes or projects, but some of the potential drawbacks, it may obscure that subjectivity. So it may give sort of a veil of objectivity when there is always going to be some subjectivity within grading. It could drive our instruction as well to the detriment of, opening it up and letting us explore a little bit more. So kind of like the teaching to the test kind of idea. It also might standardize how instructors think about student performance, and that could be a drawback because that leads to more uniformity, which in some assessment might be a good thing. In some assessment, we don't necessarily want uniformity. And it might stifle that creativity as well. It also might lead towards, along those lines, predictive performance and could, as I mentioned, limit student creativity. So we might think of a rubric as a sort of checklist, but there are some differences between checklists and rubrics. Some of the attributes of checklists is mostly yes or no absolutes. Generally, we use checklists when we're introducing maybe a more basic skill or process. We're not judging on work quality with a checklist. It's just, is it there or not? It doesn't indicate student understanding or mastery of information or a skill, and it doesn't provide detailed performance feedback for the student. So they don't really get a lot of information from a checklist. Rubrics, on the other hand, are more nuanced. They're not, black and white. We use them when assessing student learning. It helps us to evaluate the quality of student work based on specific criteria for that assessment. It also indicates to us and to students whether they've mastered that content, where they fall on a continuum, and it provides more detailed feedback on performance. And that how detailed that feedback is will depend on how you develop your rubric and how detailed those descriptors are. And we'll go over that part in just a minute. And I apologize if I have to mute myself every once in a while. I'm getting over a cold, so clear my throat. Okay, so the components of a rubric. There's multiple parts of a rubric, like there are multiple parts of a task or an assignment, and each part of the rubric is really important, but it all contributes to the whole. Rubrics can be used to assess a lot of different things, features of an oral presentation, a written report, a musical performance, math problem solving, case studies. So the components of a rubric include the task description. So that's the performance or the product of the outcome that we're assessing. It also has individual criterion. So that's a trait or a feature or a dimension or sort of a slice of the whole task. There's levels of performance. So we want to provide at least 2 levels of performance, but preferably more. We want to give ourselves some flexibility, and we also want to provide students with a little bit more information about their performance than we can get with, just 2 levels of performance. So generally 3 to 5 is a good number to have. Any more than 5, and it gets to be a little bit unruly or difficult to assess and difficult to develop the descriptors which describe those levels. So when we get to 6, 7, 8 levels of performance, how do we distinguish between that many levels of performance? So that becomes a little bit difficult where we're in that kind of middle ground. A rubric also includes scores, so that's a value that we assign to rate each of our criterion. And then you might include a weighting factor as well, so giving more value for one criterion versus another criterion. So this is an excerpt from a rubric that I've used in the past to grade an essay assignment. And this particular essay rubric had actually 6 criteria, but I'm only showing 2 just so that we can actually see them. But we've got purpose and research here, and I also had content development, organization, formatting, and mechanics. The criteria are going to appear along the left column of the rubric. This is just the way that rubrics are traditionally set up. And these are the items on which students are going to be assessed. So we've got the examples here again of purpose and research. So I'm going to assess my students on purpose and on research, among other criteria. The levels of performance appear across the top of the rubric. I like putting the highest level first and then going down the line. Some rubrics put the lowest level first, but I like to, kind of put the highest level closer to the criteria, because I'm hoping that that's where students' eyes go first. So they're not reading, what to do to be a novice. They're reading first what to do to be proficient. So again, these are the degrees to which students have mastered each criteria or each criterion. You can customize what you call these levels of performance, but you might also want to include definitions of what you mean by those terms in a grid or a blurb somewhere in the course or in the rubric itself. So if you're going to use the same terminology, the same terms for levels of performance, the same labels throughout your class for all of your rubrics, then you can, it might make sense to provide those definitions somewhere in the course on Blackboard or in your syllabus if you're going to use the same terminology. If you use different terminology for different rubrics, then you'll want to define them on the rubric. So for example, I might want to explain to my students that proficient means that the student has demonstrated an expert level of performance on the criteria, whereas competent means that the student has demonstrated an acceptable but not superior level of performance. So I would define those things for my students and not leave them to their own devices to define them for themselves. So again, descriptors appear in the other boxes of the rubric. These are descriptions of what student, for this example rubric, what student writing looks like under each criteria and for each level of performance. So as you can see in this sample, I've explained what student work should look like if it earned a proficient score for the right research criterion, And this description is going to be different than the descriptors for competent, developing, and novice level of performance. And then when I indicate that a student's proficient, they can go ahead and read that descriptor to find out what that means. So that's describing their work. There's pros and cons to writing lengthy or detailed descriptors. A pro or a benefit would be that it might make grading easier or quicker because you could leave fewer comments on student work, but and also before they've completed the assessment, those detailed descriptors can help communicate to students what they need to do to earn, whatever desired grade they want. So it might result in better student performance on the task. A con or a drawback might be that it takes a lot longer to write detailed descriptors. It can take me hours to write, to create one rubric for a new assignment. But once you've written them, you might only need to tweak them from semester to semester. So as you use them, as I use my rubrics, I always find something that I want to change the next semester to make it better, which is a lot quicker and easier than starting completely from scratch. You also might find that if your descriptors are too detailed and use absolutes, you might box yourself into grades that you don't feel are necessarily appropriate for a given student's performance. And that's some of where I do my revision of my rubrics from semester to semester. So that's why, I started using the word may throughout my rubrics. That creates a little bit more nuance when grading. I can leave comments then that further explain the score to students and why they received it. The scores for each criterion and performance level can also be listed on the rubric. If you're creating a rubric using Blackboard's rubric tool, you'll have a few options for how you want to set up the rubric, and that'll vary depending on whether you're using original course view or ultra course view. And then of course, at the end of this calendar year, start of next calendar year, we'll all be using ultra course view. But as I mentioned at the beginning of the workshop, we do have a separate workshop on interactive rubrics that addresses how to create a rubric on Blackboard, so I'm not going to go into that in this workshop. But just on the topic of scores, you'll want to keep in mind that the points values should be appropriate for each level, should emphasize the criteria you want to prioritize over others. So for example, in this sample rubric, research is more important to me when assessing a student's essays than setting up their essays using MLA format, which is further on down the line. So there's going to be fewer points awarded to that. So, those are just some things to keep in mind when you're looking at scoring. It's a lot easier to set up, the point systems and make sure that they work the way that you want them to when you're using interactive rubrics, but you still want to test that out and make sure that that those points are set up correctly. You could also not weight your points and just have everything worth the same amount of points if it's proficient, competent, developing. So this would be an unweighted grade. Each criterion is worth the same amount. So we're just assigning points consistently based on level of performance, and that just weights everything evenly. Everything is equally important. Or you can use a points range as well. So proficient might be 4 points, or proficient might be 10 points, competent might be, 7 to 9 points. And then, I would need to explain to my student, why they got 7 versus 9. But, that's another option where you could use that. Or you can use percentages too. So instead of assigning point values, Blackboard, you can use Blackboard rubrics to automatically calculate for you using weighted grades, and then you can use percentages for proficient, competent, developing, novice. So basically you can use point values to weight your grades, or you can use percentages up to 100%. But it just depends on what you want to do, what you think is going to be easiest for your students to understand as well. So let's talk about task analysis. Task analysis is when we break the assignment or the task into its unique components or dimensions. So we begin with something that we want to assess. We consider its features, and then we determine how to represent those features in our rubric. So for this example, it's the writing process that I'm assessing. The rubric should address all aspects of the outcomes being measured and shouldn't address anything extraneous to those outcomes. So for example, spelling and grammar are going to be really important for me as a writing instructor, but they might be considered extraneous on a science assessment unless we're planning to measure an outcome that deals specifically with spelling and grammar for that assessment. So, we need to have the correct spelling for scientific terminology, for example. If the assignment needs to address critical thinking skills, does the rubric reflect that? Which of your course outcomes does the assignment address? That's where we want to make sure that our outcomes are aligned. So our outcomes for individual tasks or individual assessments should align to our course outcomes in some way. So something that might be helpful with that is if you create that alignment chart for yourself where you have, the outcomes that are being assessed. And that's also a good way to assess whether we are covering all of those outcomes through our course assessments and covering them adequately. And then are those elements being assessed in this individual rubric that you're creating? A criterion is the feature that we want to measure to judge student performance. We should derive our criteria from assignment prompts, grading sheets, checklists, anything else that we've used to help students prepare for the assessment. But we want to keep the number of criteria manageable, both for ourselves and for our students. Too many criteria might signal that the assessment is trying to do too much. It also might be confusing for students, and it'll be very time consuming for you to develop and to use it for grading. So for each assessment, we want to determine what exactly we want to assess. It should be tied to our course objectives, our learning objectives, and how are we going to assess it using this particular assignment. And then we can create a more effective rubric. And we can also see whether maybe an assessment is trying to do too much and we need to create multiple assessments that focus on more specific criteria and fewer criterion. So here are some ways that criteria may change based on the type of assessment being conducted. So if we've got, a web presentation, we might be assessing for technical quality, for aesthetics or design, visuals, writing mechanics, whereas for a written or typed paper, we might be looking at the content, the organization, thesis statement, writing conventions for the genre. And then for a musical performance, our criteria might be steadiness, breathing, appropriate instrument usage, interpretation, accuracy. So our criteria will change dramatically based on the type of assessment or the type of task that we are assessing. Levels of performance, those are the things that go across the top of the rubric. They use adjectives to describe degrees of mastery. So for example, you might say exemplary or proficient, competent, acceptable, satisfactory, developing, novice, whatever terminology you prefer. We want to determine the number of levels that are necessary to assess distinctions of performance. Begin with the fewer that you think you need, and then move to more if you really need to. Like I said, 3 to 5 is really that sweet spot. The more labels on the rubric, the more difficult it might be, as I mentioned before, to differentiate between them and to articulate precisely why one student's work falls into the skill level it does. So that's why I would recommend no more than 5 levels of performance. Also, labels could influence interpretations of the performance level. In addition to better communicating our expectations to our students, levels of performance help us more consistently and objectively distinguish between acceptable and unacceptable performance, or between exemplary, satisfactory, and novice performance when we're evaluating our students' work. And labels can be used with or without descriptors. So you don't necessarily have to include descriptors in your rubric, but adding those descriptors can cut down on the amount of written feedback you need to provide, and it could signal to students that you're more objective on your assessment. Whereas, if you have a blank grid, students might wonder, what does competent mean? Is my professor just kind of making it up as they go along while they're grading my work? So having those descriptors, at least something in the descriptor areas, is definitely beneficial to students if we give them that rubric ahead of time, which I do recommend, so that they know, how they're going to be evaluated and what their expectations are. But, using those descriptors could also necessitate, clarification of performance and criteria when the student's work doesn't necessarily match the descriptor precisely. So we want to, give detailed enough descriptors or descriptions that students understand why they're receiving, a certain level of performance on that criterion, but not so detailed that, it's really difficult for us to place students along those levels of performance, because they're so specific that, maybe a student meets one part of it but doesn't meet another part. So that's where we really need to be careful about how we describe things. So as I mentioned before, you can personalize your labels as long as you explain what they mean. So here's an example of an explanation using a table. You could also just write these out in sentence format. You don't necessarily have to include this information with every rubric. You could just include it somewhere on Blackboard or in your syllabus grading section, particularly, like I mentioned before, if you're using the same performance level labels for all of your rubrics. But if you plan on changing them, or if for one rubric you've got 4 levels of performance, for another rubric you've got 5, another rubric you've got 3, and you want to differentiate between those levels of performance within those rubrics, then you might need to, again, like I mentioned before, include this explanation in the rubric itself. Or you could include, even if you're using the same one, you could include the explanations in each rubric anyway, just because then you don't have to field those student questions about what does this mean, and then have to redirect them to where that information is. So a little bit more on descriptors. Descriptors are meant to spell out each level or gradation of performance for each of our criterion, describe what performance at that level looks like, tell students how their work is being assessed, and help us distinguish between those levels of student work. It can be omitted, but it does aid in that appearance of objectivity when we've designed them well. Descriptors should contain, at the very least, a description of the highest level of performance, and that would be called a scoring guide if you include only the highest level. And descriptors also articulate what you mean by your labels too. So what does proficient mean for purpose? What does proficient mean for research? Here's another example of a weighted rubric that hasn't been filled in yet with descriptors. So I've weighted here the various dimensions according to their significance. And to do this, we would add descriptors to identify what performance would look like, again, in each criterion for each level. So when we're considering scores and how many points are needed to describe adequately the range of performance that we're seeking in student work, scores are a system of numbers or values to rate our criterion, and they can be quantitative, qualitative, a combination. So as I mentioned, you can range your performance levels by high to low or low to high. I prefer, as I mentioned previously, putting the higher grades first. Then we divide them into the levels of performance. A 5-point scale might imply A to F grading, and then that middle number could gravitate to the mean. You could use a separate scale for each criterion, which we've discussed as weighted grades. But make sure to define what scores will align with the items on your rubric. Assign the points values or define what performance levels are based on the attributes or the criteria present. So we're thinking of these scores or the scales as part of a continuum of quality of student work. So next we're going to just go through some different types of rubrics in a little more detail so we can see how they differ. What we've seen mostly so far is analytic rubrics, but there's holistic rubrics. This provides an overall assessment with a single scale of performance. An analytic rubric assesses separate attributes, criterion, dimensions across performance levels. Task-specific rubrics measures one unique task, and a general rubric measures criteria that are general across tasks. So there's multiple tasks and there's criteria that are general across them. So a holistic rubric means that you're treating the whole rather than its parts. So in contrast to an analytic rubric, it does not list separate levels of performance for each criterion. Instead, it assigns a level of performance by assessing the performance across multiple criteria as a whole. And I'll show you an example of that. Holistic rubrics are best suited for simple projects or performances. They give a quick snapshot or overview of quality of student work. They rate the entire project, activity, or performance at once, provide a single score on all criteria. So all of our criteria are evaluated simultaneously. It combines all of the important elements of the project or performance, and it's useful for summative or large scale assessment as well. Some considerations to be aware of: there's no analysis of strengths and weaknesses. There isn't as much feedback to guide improvement, so it might not be useful for formative assessment, where they might need more details about the individual criteria and where their strengths and weaknesses are so that they can improve. Here's an example of a holistic rubric for a bibliography. So we've got exemplary, competent, deficient, and then we've got an explanation of what each one is. So for it to be exemplary, it would have to list 10 or more sources, include no historical inaccuracy, clearly indicate from which sources information was drawn, and provide all relevant information. And then competent, it's 5 to 9 sources. There might be a few historical inaccuracies, et cetera, et cetera. So we've got all of our criteria within each one of these levels just listed and described, and then we're just holistically evaluating. And then analytic rubrics, which we've seen, that's what most rubrics tend to be. It articulates levels of performance for each criterion, so we can assess our students' performance on each of those criterion separately. They're useful for complex performances, skills, and projects that have multiple criteria or dimensions. One of the benefits of this is that we can judge each individual specific criterion separately. And it provides a separate score for each of those criterion, which helps with weighting scores, reveals strengths and weaknesses to students in their performance, so they know what areas they need to work on. And it can be used for students to self-assess their understanding or performance as well. So students can use that rubric to kind of score themselves. One of the drawbacks that it might take time to score using the analytic rubric. It definitely takes more time to score than it does with a holistic rubric. So again, this is the history report analytic rubric. So we could assess how well a student did on organization and distinguish that from how well the student performed on historical accuracy, rather than lumping all of those criteria together. All right, so task-specific rubrics provide detailed guidance for a single task. So it provides for consistent scoring. I know it's a little bit difficult to see this rubric here, but I will send out examples afterwards as well. But it provides for consistent scoring and identifies what students know, for example, facts or procedures, methods, equations. But it might be more difficult to develop a new rubric for each task, and it might become a lot of work because you'll need a lot of rubrics if it's for individual specific tasks. So for this example, it's an oral presentation, and it's about argument vocal performance, so specifically vocal performance, volume, clarity, expression. And then we might have another one for content, a task-specific rubric specifically for that. General rubrics can be used across similar performances or projects, so all similar projects or presentations. It helps students see the bigger picture, helps reduce some development time. The feedback, however, might be too general. So for example, this would be a general rubric. You might have a general rubric for all essays in a class. But if you're having students write different genres or different types of writing, then it may not be appropriate to have a general rubric for all of those types of assessments. But if, for example, you're having students in an online class do a reading journal, and all of the reading journals are going to be assessed with the same criteria, you might have a general rubric for that. All right, so let's move into developing a rubric, and we'll just move right along here. So the first step is selecting a task, an authentic task to assess. Identify ways that students can demonstrate that they've met goals and objectives, and try to avoid inessential expectations. One thing that we advocate for is replicating meaningful tasks that are found in the real world, or authentic assessment, or encouraging students to problem solve and apply their knowledge. So getting into those higher level demonstrations of knowledge. Also, we want to make sure that our rubric relates to the outcomes that are being measured. It should match our learning goals and objectives. It should address all aspects of those outcomes. It shouldn't address anything outside of that. And we want to select a task that might be difficult to grade, where we want to remove subjectivity. That task will better assist students in understanding their performance expectations. After we've got the task that we want to develop our rubric for, we need to determine the criteria. So all of the details of the tasks should be listed. What do we want to assess or measure? And then we want to think about standards of excellence or competencies that students need to demonstrate when they're performing that task. We then can chunk or group together similar dimensions from that list, and then categorize them, and that's how we'll develop our criteria. We want to limit our categories to a manageable list, and then add details within those criteria categories. Then we set our levels. So we want to identify those gradations of quality. Sometimes we could just use, a numerical value instead of a label. So if you just want to do, points-based, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Also keep in mind that those differences between the levels can be difficult to distinguish as you add more levels of performance. So again, begin with fewer levels. Distinguish between work that does or doesn't meet the criteria. So what are the highest and lowest levels of performance, and then write your descriptors for those. Those are going to be the easiest descriptors to write, because it's sometimes difficult to make those finer distinctions within the middle of the rubric. And then we write our descriptors. So we want to write appropriate descriptions for each performance level, for each criterion. Explain what the performance looks like at each of those levels. So the depth, the breadth, the quality, the scope, extent, complexity, the degree, the accuracy, whatever's appropriate. And then include indicators for each level. So consistent, inconsistent, always or rarely. And then our subsequent descriptions typically incorporate or echo previous descriptions, but change them based on, what might be included or not included that needs to be. Then we just determine our score values. So what's our maximum number of points for achieving the highest level? And then we assign an appropriate number to each of the lower levels of quality. Gradation should make sense mathematically depending on the total number of points available, the number of criteria, the number of performance levels. So we can assign point values or percentages to each level. And consider that scoring scale consistency. So whenever I create a rubric, I then go through and figure out, test it out. If a student does this, and this, what would their score be? Does that make sense? So yeah, test and revise, try it out, compare it, an initial score without the rubric. So grade a sample without the rubric to one you would give with the rubric, see if there's some consistency there or more accuracy or more objectivity, maybe. You could review it with a colleague. So ask a colleague to look over your rubric and see if it's, makes sense, if it's in line with what your objectives are for the course. Use it in class. You could describe and solicit student input prior to implementing it. So have students look it over and see whether they understand it and give you feedback, and then revise it before you implement it. And then, repeat the process again for the next semester. So if you, grade using that rubric and you find there could be improvements, then improve it for the next semester. Some considerations when we're creating or selecting a rubric, because we don't have to reinvent the wheel. Sometimes I will start with a rubric that someone else has already created that I find on, a rubric sharing website, and then I tailor it to my own needs or revise it. Or sometimes I gut it completely and redo it, but sometimes it helps having that starting language instead of staring at a blank rubric. But some questions: does the rubric align with our outcomes or objectives for that particular assessment, as well as for the course overall? Does it include performance levels? Do the criteria reflect current notions of excellence in our field? Are scores well defined and consistent? Is the rubric as fair and bias-free as we can make it? Does the rubric allow for inter-rater reliability? So if you were to give this rubric to, a TA or another instructor or faculty member, could they use it and get the same scores that you would get if you graded using that rubric? And then, is the rubric useful, practical, and manageable? We want our rubrics to be manageable both for our students and for ourselves. Some of the benefits or things that rubrics can do for us and for our students: it can function as an instructional and an evaluation tool. So we give a rubric to our student ahead of time, which I'm in favor of, so students know how they're going to be graded ahead of time. So it helps as an instructional tool in that way, and then when we use it to evaluate, it becomes an evaluation tool. It also helps us facilitate timely feedback. Timely feedback is really important for students. So I try to get my students feedback within a week of the due date of an assignment, and rubrics really help with that. Cuts down on the amount of comments that I have to leave, although I still do, provide comments to provide individualized feedback. It also helps us refine our teaching by better organizing or defining our expectations, and it helps facilitate communication between us and our students. It prepares and guides students' work so they know what's expected of them so that they can perform well. And it helps us assess student work individually and as a whole. So ultimately, rubrics help us promote meaningful assessment and evaluation for our students. I mentioned that there's an upcoming workshop on creating rubrics in Blackboard, and here's the information for that. I'll post the link to our upcoming programs page in the chat here, and that's where you'll find that, as well as other upcoming workshops for February. We have our workshops that our center staff are going to be providing, as well as some vendor workshops there too. So take a look at those, and particularly if you want to know, you're interested in creating rubrics, interactive rubrics in Blackboard, this is a good one That's coming up towards the end of the month, February 23rd. And it will, so if you can't make it to this workshop, we do have recorded workshops on our YouTube page from previous iterations of the workshop. It is nice, though, to attend the workshop if you can, because then you can ask questions that you have along the way versus watching a recording and not really being able to interact with that. All right, so some resources that I'm going to send to you after the workshop here. There's some worksheets that I'll send you, some templates for rubrics too, other types of rubrics, including the Association of American Colleges and Universities rubrics. They've got information literacy rubric, as well as a reading value rubric. So there's a lot of value rubrics there that are for more difficult to grade things with rubrics. So like, for example, critical thinking. How do we grade critical thinking with a rubric? Well, they've got a rubric for that. So I'll send you that information. And there's more information about value rubrics that I can send you there too. Let me see if I can. I'll have to send that to you afterwards. So some of the references, and I'll send these to you afterward as well, and some selected resources. But there's a ton of information out there about rubrics. You don't have to start from scratch. You can if you want to. You know, you've got a unique assessment that you want to create a rubric for. Someone probably has one out there that you can start from, or you can try your hand at creating it yourself, or collaborate on rubrics with your colleagues, or contact us in CITL to help out with rubrics. We can help you develop those too. So thank you all for attending and participating today. If you have any questions, you can stick around. Otherwise, have a great week and stay warm this week. Next week will be a bit of a warm up for us here in Illinois, but thank you all for joining.